I'm sorry, sir, but items in that case begin at $85,000, the sales associate said, the polished corners of her smile faltering beneath the weight of disbelief. To anyone watching closely, it wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. The polite cadence of her voice couldn't disguise the strain behind her eyes, the way her posture stiffened as soon as he approached. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even concern. It was a subtle assertion. You don't belong here. The murmurs were soft at first, but the message was deafening. The man didn't flinch. He simply nodded, serene. No eye roll. No raised voice. Just the same kind of stillness reserved for those who had already survived much worse. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. The boutique was called Caravelle, an opulent, velvet-wrapped monument to luxury on the corner of North Camden Drive, just off Beverly Hills' glittering artery of high fashion. For the average person, walking past Caravelle was like strolling past a glass box filled with forbidden fruit. Handcrafted Swiss watches glimmered like restrained power behind temperature-controlled cases. A single accessory here could cost more than a car or a down payment on a home. Inside, it smelled of money, not freshly printed bills but legacy wealth. The kind that came with its own advisors, its own scent trail of mahogany and bergamot. The kind of money you wore, not discussed. And this was the sacred playground of its disciples. That Friday at precisely 2:47 p.m., a man named Julian Ashcroft pushed through the doors. He was tall, early 40s, with sharp cheekbones and an understated frame. His hoodie was slate gray, his jeans worn just enough to whisper casual confidence, and his sneakers, though visibly used, bore the delicate stitching of bespoke Italian craftsmanship. A leather backpack with frayed straps clung loosely to one shoulder. From his belt loop dangled a key fob, black and chrome, emblazoned with the winged insignia of a Bentley. Yet it wasn't the details that drew attention. It was the dissonance. How could someone who looked so ordinary walk so assuredly into a place like Caravelle? The staff noticed immediately. It started with subtle things. Emma, the sales associate with a decade of experience, stiffened behind the watch counter. She kept her hands busy, reorganizing pearl strands that had already been arranged to perfection. Her colleague, Sarah, a manager who prided herself on reading people before they even speak, hovered near the security intercom with a thumb poised just above the alert button. Julian made no attempt to browse aimlessly. He walked straight to the back, to the center island where the Philippe Nautilus models sat under spotlighted glass. These weren't just watches. These were declarations, compact vaults of design, precision, and exclusivity. They weren't bought. They were earned. As he bent slightly to read the specifications, the room seemed to inhale. He was here on purpose. Yet no one offered him water. No one asked if they could help. No one moved. Emma, who just moments before had walked a client through the history of Patek Philippe's 5711, suddenly found herself too preoccupied with dusting invisible particles off a velvet tray to look up. It was only when Julian gently cleared his throat that she reluctantly turned his way. Not with the warmth of salesmanship, but with the slow, careful pivot of suspicion. A glance. Not at his eyes, but at his clothes, his skin tone, his backpack. Then, she stepped forward. Her voice was even practiced, but to those tuned to hear it, the cold undercurrent was unmistakable. That's when the tension began to draw in spectators. A teenager near the accessory wall, live streaming her day of Beverly bougie window shopping, angled her phone discreetly toward the commotion. She had 300 followers then. By the end of the next hour, that number would grow tenfold. Julian asked politely if he could view the Nautilus in the center. Emma hesitated. She claimed the model required special handling clearance, a $25,000 deposit to even bring it out of the case. Julian responded with a gentle nod. Cash or wire transfer? He asked. And that's when things began to shift. Emma's smirk twitched. Sarah emerged from the shadows. The boutique manager walked over, clipboard in hand, practice poise in every step. her voice wrapped in honey but laced with condescension. They had policies, she explained. Protocols. Luxury wasn't just about price, it was about discretion. And in this case, about verifying that the request to see such a piece was genuine. Julian simply nodded again and produced a credit card. Not just any card, a black metal centurion. The kind that doesn't have a credit limit. The kind that isn't applied for but offered. Sarah blinked. Emma's expression faltered. Still, they pushed further. Sarah asked for identification. Julian handed over a leather wallet. Custom. Slim. Inside was a corporate ID and a matching executive-level security pass embossed with the letters J.A. Group. The name Julian Ashcroft. CO. The store's silence was now fractured only by the clicking of phones going live. The teen stream climbed past 1,200 viewers. Comments began to flood. He's being profiled. Did she just say $25,000 just to look? This guy's got billionaire energy. Watch this go viral. Meanwhile, Security Mike, who had spent a decade as a bodyguard for VIP clients, stood by, watching, unsure. Julian was polite, soft-spoken, and composed. Yet the tension from management's body language demanded escalation. That's when Sarah spoke the words that would be replayed, clipped, captioned, and dissected across the internet. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're making other guests uncomfortable. Julian simply looked around. There were only 5 guests in the boutique. 3 were actively watching the scene unfold. 1 had just started recording. None looked even remotely disturbed, except perhaps by what was being said. But he didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He looked at his watch, an understated Vacheron Constantine. The kind that, if you knew what it was, told you everything. It was 2:59 p.m. I have 1 more minute, he said softly. Then he smiled. Not out of amusement, but out of calculation. Because at 3 p.m., exactly 1 floor above this boutique, a boardroom would begin filling with executives. None of whom knew that their landlord, their silent investor, the man who owned their lease, had just been kicked out of his own building. The clock ticked forward. It was time. And Julian Ashcroft was just getting started. The air inside Caravelle was no longer serene. Moments after Julian Ashcroft had quietly asked to see the Philippe Nautilus, the subtle theater of suspicion gave way to a full-blown performance of institutional gatekeeping. From the outside, everything still looked polished. Lighting perfect, floors gleaming, associates in sleek uniforms moving with manufactured grace. But if you listened closely, you could hear it. The tension in the silences between words, the small breaths held too long, the clipped tones behind professional smiles. To the untrained eye, this was simply customer service. But for those who lived it, who recognized the texture of microaggressions, who had once smiled through being dismissed, this was something else. Something ugly wrapped in velvet. Sarah, the boutique manager, took over the interaction with the kind of professionalism that cloaked condescension in policy. She had learned early in her career to frame exclusion not as offense, but as obligation. She didn't need to be cruel. She only needed to be correct. She'd already decided that Julian's presence was a disruption. Now she simply needed the language to justify it. A $25,000 deposit was required to handle watches in that tier, she explained. For security reasons. For inventory integrity. For customer safety. It was always for something noble. Julian, calm as still water, responded without complaint. He didn't argue. He didn't challenge. He simply nodded once and asked whether cash or wire was preferred. It was the wrong answer. Not because it was impolite, but because it left them with no more excuses. No next step to push him out politely. No further process to hide behind. He'd answered the question, met the requirement. Yet instead of opening the display, Sarah's smile thinned. She moved the goalpost. Now they would need ID and credit card verification, both of which Julian produced without hesitation. A Centurion card, heavier than most cards and darker than suspicion, landed gently on the counter. A custom leather wallet followed, housing a government-issued ID and a corporate access pass, credentials that would make most executives pause. Still, nothing moved. Emma took the card and ID with trembling fingers. Not out of fear, but uncertainty. The script was off. She'd expected him to back down, to protest, to leave. Instead, he remained composed, an immovable figure in the center of their curated universe. A mirror held up to their biases. In the background, the teenage live streamer's audience had tripled. What began as quiet commentary on boutique aesthetics had turned into an unfolding drama, watched by strangers who didn't need the audio to know what was happening. One viewer wrote, "He's wearing a $100,000 watch and they're treating him like he's shoplifting." Another, "How many hoops do black customers need to jump through to get basic respect?" Julian checked his phone. 2 minutes to 3 p.m. A group of customers nearby had started paying closer attention. One of them, a woman with salt and pepper curls and gold-plated glasses, watched the entire exchange with the silence of someone who had once been there, who had once stood in those same shoes. The subtle nod she gave Julian from across the store said more than words ever could. Sarah, sensing the shift in energy, called over Mike Torres, the boutique's long-serving security guard. Mike, former LAPD and now private security, had worked enough retail floors to know when things were about to unravel. He watched Julian carefully, not for threats but for posture, body language, escalation cues. He saw none. The man was not flustered. He was not aggressive. He wasn't even inconvenienced. He was waiting, and that terrified them. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he carried. But they knew that calm like his didn't come from submission, came from control, from power. Sarah leaned in now, a final attempt to reclaim dominance masked as diplomacy. She gestured toward the exit, gently but firmly informing him that his presence was beginning to make other patrons uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, that word, so often weaponized, hung in the air like second-hand smoke. A word meant to shield bigotry under the guise of maintaining experience. A word that told Julian, without telling him, that his presence was the disruption. That their discomfort was his responsibility. That no matter his manner, his money, or his credentials, his appearance alone was the problem. Julian didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked around. There were no signs of discomfort. The other customers weren't disturbed. If anything, they were disturbed by what they were witnessing. Phones were out. Brows furrowed. Eyes wide. Still, Sarah held her ground. Mike shifted from one foot to the other, unsure whether he was protecting the store or about to be used to enforce a decision that made no sense to him. Julian, still silent, checked his watch. 2:59 p.m. The TikTok stream was now at 6,200 viewers. In the comments, someone wrote, "I hope this man owns the building. That'd be the most satisfying ending ever." Another added, "He's too calm. He's planning something." And they were right, because what Sarah didn't know, what Emma didn't see, what Mike couldn't quite place, was that Julian Ashcroft wasn't just a prospective customer. He wasn't there to browse. He wasn't there for a social experiment. He was there because Caravelle had been flagged in his internal audit. Julian was the founder of Ashcroft Equity Partners, a quiet investment firm with loud capital. 3 weeks prior, the firm had acquired controlling interest in the real estate portfolio that housed Caravelle and 4 other boutiques across the luxury corridor. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an inspection, a stress test, a revelation, and the hands of the store's own employees had written the results for him in real time. Julian took one final glance around the boutique. At the watch he never got to see. At the employees who had passed their own judgment. At the customers now watching everything unravel with phones raised high and empathy surfacing slowly. Then, at 3 p.m. sharp, he pressed a single button on his phone. A message sent. Subject line, "Audit complete. Meeting in 5. Location, boardroom, floor 7. Recipients, Ashcroft Equity Executive Team." He smiled once. Soft, composed, and laced with meaning. Then he turned toward the door. As he exited, Sarah exhaled, the way one exhales after a storm passes. Emma quietly returned the card and ID to the counter, hands colder now. Mike stayed in place, watching the door close behind the man who had left like mist, without noise. but not without consequence. And above them, 7 floors up, a conference room lit up with screens. Executives sat down with coffee and confusion, not yet knowing they were about to be shown livestream footage from the floor below. Footage that would change hiring practices, restructure management, force emergency legal reviews. Because the man they had just dismissed, he owned the floor beneath their feet. And the only thing more dangerous than misjudging a man like Julian Ashcroft was doing it on camera. The door had barely clicked shut behind Julian Ashcroft when the boutique's fragile calm began to unravel. A silence hung like static over the showroom floor, interrupted only by the faint hum of the refrigeration systems behind the glass watch cases and the sound of soft heels scuttling nervously across marble. Emma Rodriguez stood frozen near the counter, her fingers still curled from where they had clutched Julian's Centurion card only moments earlier. She hadn't even noticed herself return it, hadn't registered the weight of it, the name etched into its surface, the gleam of status it exuded. All she knew now was that her breath was shallow and her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Sarah, the manager, had gone pale. The commanding posture she wore like a badge had begun to slip. There was something about the way he'd left, silent, composed, too quiet, that told her the scene hadn't ended. It had merely transitioned into the next act. And somehow, she wasn't in control of the script anymore. The tension didn't fade as he left. It deepened. It wrapped itself around the boutique like an invisible thread, tightening by the second. The teenager at the scarf table was still live streaming. Her viewership had ballooned past 10,000. In her soft voice, barely above a whisper, she narrated what she'd just witnessed. A black man asked to leave a luxury store despite showing ID, a top-tier credit card, and polite composure. She didn't say it was racism. She didn't need to. The comments in her feed had already done that. He handled that better than I ever could. Bet they just kicked out their landlord and don't even know it. Keep filming. This is history. From her corner, Emma's coworker Marla was typing furiously on her phone. The store's group chat had lit up like a warning flare. Screenshots of Julian's credit card, the name on the ID, blurry images of him at the Philippe watch case. Everything was flying between staff and friends of staff faster than discretion could contain it. And then came the ripple. Sarah's phone buzzed in her blazer pocket. One buzz, then 2, then a series of dings, each faster than the last, until it seemed the phone might vibrate itself out of her coat entirely. She ignored it at first, thinking perhaps it was the security alert system, or one of her staff reporting something else. But when Emma glanced down at her own device and gasped, Sarah knew something had shifted. The first message Sarah read made her skin run cold. Did you seriously just ask Julian Ashcroft to leave? The second, from her district supervisor. Emergency all staff Zoom in 10. Don't ask. Just join. The third wasn't a message, it was a push notification. From Forbes. Billionaire investor Julian Ashcroft conducts undercover audit in Beverly Hills luxury district. Emma's voice, now barely audible through the pounding blood in Sarah's ears, cracked as she read aloud the headline. The words landed like bricks. Ashcroft Equity Partners. Boutique acquisitions. Luxury real estate takeovers. Retail portfolio restructuring. Julian hadn't been a browser. He hadn't been looking. He had been watching. From above. From within. And now the industry was watching back. By the time Sarah had the clarity to check the internal company Slack channel, the situation had erupted. Corporate leadership had already been pinged. Screenshots of the live stream were circulating on Twitter and TikTok, and comments under the boutique's Google reviews were flooding in with speed and venom. They judged a man by his skin, not his status. Never shopping here again. Turns out he owns the building. Oops. Do better, Caravelle. The damage wasn't just public. It was operational. The store's private Instagram page had lost 1,200 followers in under 20 minutes. Their most recent post, an image of a champagne toast with the caption "Luxury is earned," had become a digital battleground. It wasn't just social media anymore. Local reporters were retweeting the video. Social justice accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers were demanding a statement. Civil rights advocates were calling it a teachable moment. Brand influencers who once tagged Caravelle in their designer hauls were now sharing clips of the incident with captions like, "Not the vibe." Sarah, still clinging to whatever dignity she could muster, tried to calm the team. She reminded them this could be salvaged. It was just a misunderstanding. PR crisis, yes, but not a career-ending one. But then the fourth message came through. This one had a different weight. It wasn't from a coworker or a social media account. It was from corporate legal. Subject: internal review required. Flagged incident, Madison Property Group. Attached was a single document. It was Julian's photo. A headshot, professional, from a business magazine cover story dated 6 months prior. The file name was all Sarah needed to see. Ownerprofile.pdf. The pieces clicked into place. The reason he had asked about wiring money, the way he had studied the watch, not as a buyer but as an auditor. The way he had spoken so softly, so patiently. The way he had looked around the store as if memorizing every detail. He had never needed to buy the watch. He already owned the store. And suddenly Sarah's badge, her authority, her confidence, felt like a costume. Her clipboard, her policies, her protocols, props on a stage that had just collapsed around her. Emma sat down on the edge of the counter, her legs trembling too hard to support her. Mike Torres, the security guard, who'd once worked executive protection for high-level clients, stood still as stone near the door, silently wondering how much longer he would have a job. He had seen corporate fallout before, but never like this. Never this personal. The TikTok stream passed 18,000 viewers. Commenters were now tagging journalists, and lawyers, and the NAACP, and Forbes. Julian's name trended in 3 U.S. cities within the hour. Above them, 7 floors up, the lights in Ashcroft Equity's boardroom were on. Screens lit up. Executives filed in. Documents printed on thick paper landed on glass tables with audible thuds. The first slide in Julian's presentation? Caravelle Customer Service Integrity Audit. The second? Incident number 24. On-site discrimination. Beverly Hills flagship. The boutique had failed the test. Not just failed it, but done so on camera in high definition, in front of an audience of thousands who didn't need a press release to understand what they had just seen. And all because one man had walked in dressed like he didn't belong, and left exactly as he intended, unseen, unapologetic, and holding all the cards. By 3 p.m., the sun outside Caravelle cast long streaks of amber light across the boutique's marble floor. But inside, the atmosphere had grown icier with each second that ticked past. Unseen above the retail space, in a glass-walled conference room on the 7th floor of the same building, power quietly convened. The table in conference room B wasn't just any meeting table. It was a slab of black lacquered walnut, custom designed for the senior partners of Ashcroft Equity Partners. Around it sat a dozen executives, their laptops open but untouched, their phones silent in deference. On one end of the screen appeared the corporate counsel, already linked in remotely from New York. On the other, the director of retail operations, his brows furrowed, the tension already showing in the creases beneath his eyes. And then Julian walked in, no longer wearing the silence of a dismissed customer. He entered with the stillness of a storm gathering force. His hoodie, casual as ever, now seemed ceremonial, an intentional symbol of the judgment he'd received. The leather backpack still hung from his shoulder, the same one that had been visually dismissed minutes earlier on the showroom floor. Yet this time, no one in the room mistook it for anything less than a messenger of truth. A few in the room stood instinctively. Some greeted him by title. Most stayed quiet. He didn't need fanfare. The gravity of his presence was enough. A folder was placed on the table in front of him. Printed reports, timestamps, clipped video thumbnails, all marked for internal review. The heading on the cover page read, Madison Property Group, Luxury Retail Cultural Compliance Report, and below it, one subhead in bold, Incident number 24, Beverly Hills Caravelle Flagship, 3 p.m. Audit, response required. Julian sat down and opened the first slide of the presentation. The room darkened slightly as the monitor glowed to life. The TikTok video was already embedded. The footage played, unedited, from the boutique's overhead camera synced with the viral clip. There was no need for narration. The images told the story. His polite inquiry, the delayed response, the layering of excuses, the repeated requests for verification, and finally, the quiet demand for his exit. All captured, all time-stamped, all indisputable. To the world outside, it had been a social media moment. To those in this room, it was a legal, ethical, and financial disaster. Patricia Wong, Ashcroft Equity's chief legal counsel, spoke first. Not to soften the blow, but to quantify it. She reviewed the relevant local and federal anti-discrimination statutes, the consequences of biased customer service practices, the legal exposure for retail tenants operating in properties owned by Ashcroft Equity. Based on the footage, the boutique had breached not only corporate ethical standards, but specific contract language requiring fair and unbiased treatment in all Ashcroft leased properties. The numbers were stark. Fines in the six-figure range per incident, possible lawsuits, reputational damage that could spread through their entire real estate portfolio. Julian listened, not with rage, but with the calculated calm of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. David Kim, director of retail operations, followed with internal data. In the last year alone, Caravelle had registered a 340% increase in customer complaints related to service bias, disproportionately involving customers of color. The store had, until now, maintained its prestige through sheer aesthetic power and affluent clientele. But metrics didn't lie. Customer demographics in Beverly Hills had shifted. Younger, more diverse luxury shoppers were entering the market and being quietly turned away through coded gestures, policies, and smiles that never reached the eyes. And then came the slide that quieted the room even further. Customer service audit footage, last 90 days. 23 documented incidents. Almost all followed a pattern. Minimal assistance, escalated security involvement, and refusal to engage beyond a basic level of service. The 24th incident, captured just minutes ago, was different only in one regard. This time, the person they turned away didn't just buy watches. He owned the building. Julian clicked to the next slide himself. It was a summary. 3 options. Option 1. Immediate lease termination. The boutique would have 30 days to vacate. All marketing and PR support would be revoked. Option 2. Legal escalation. A public audit would be conducted. The boutique would face federal investigation under California's Civil Code and public scrutiny from social justice organizations already tracking the footage. Option 3. Structural reform. The third option wasn't a reprieve. It was a contract. It included immediate suspension of involved staff pending retraining, mandatory cultural competency certification for all employees, the appointment of an independent diversity officer to oversee operations, a $100,000 donation to community legal aid focused on combating discrimination in commercial retail spaces, quarterly compliance audits with full transparency, and a public apology signed by the boutique's senior management, acknowledging the specific wrongdoing. Julian paused there. He looked up at the room. Not one pair of eyes met his directly. In this moment, he didn't need to name what had happened. He didn't need to raise his voice or dissect the specifics of how he was treated. The footage had done that for him. The internet had done that. Public sentiment had turned already, and was sharpening its teeth by the minute. Across social media, hashtags were climbing. Hashtag Ashcroft Audit. Hashtag Retail While Black. Hashtag Caravelle Exposed. The world had seen, and the world had judged. What came next, Julian knew, would determine not only the fate of Caravelle, but the example it would set for every other luxury retailer embedded in properties owned by Ashcroft Equity. He offered no speech, no threat, just the facts, just the evidence. This was no longer personal. It was systemic, and systems, when broken, had to be rebuilt from the root. He gave them until 6 p.m. to decide. Then he closed the folder, stood, and walked out, not in anger, but with the unshakable certainty of a man who understood something that the boutique had forgotten. Respect cannot be bought, but the lack of it can cost everything. As the clock struck 3:47 p.m., the boutique below still reeked of stale tension and perfumed discomfort. But on the 7th floor, above the glittering displays and gleaming watch glass, the mood was entirely different, charged, electric, laced with dread. The boardroom was soundproof, but not emotion-proof. Inside, a silence sat heavy, made weightier by the knowledge of what was to come. Every person in that room, executives, counsel, operations heads, understood they had miscalculated. Some had known from the second Julian Ashcroft's name appeared on the audit report. Others only after watching the footage now etched into the annals of viral accountability. But all of them were now adjusting to a new gravitational pull. One man's quiet authority anchoring the room with the force of uncomfortable truth. Julian had laid out the options clearly. He hadn't demanded loyalty or begged for understanding. He had presented data, consequences, and timelines. The choice wasn't between comfort and discomfort, it was between irrelevance and reform. Robert Madison, founder of Caravelle, dialed in remotely from his yacht off the coast of Portofino. His background, picturesque and sunlit, clashed painfully with the atmosphere in the room. He had watched the livestream. He had seen the footage replayed on television between luxury car commercials and stock tickers. The internet had already cast its vote. And the stock market, notoriously unforgiving of ethical missteps, had started to respond. It wasn't the kind of crisis a brand bounced back from with a discount code and a tightly edited apology video. This was structural, generational. It had nothing to do with products and everything to do with presence, who was allowed to belong and who had to prove they did. Robert had built Caravelle to be a fortress of taste. But the walls he'd raised, subtly, incrementally, institutionally, were now the very walls closing in. He tried to rationalize what had happened. He hadn't known. No one had told him. Julian didn't announce himself. But even as those thoughts formed, he knew they were hollow. Because that was the entire point. Wealth wasn't always worn on sleeves. Power didn't always walk in with a security detail and polished shoes. And dignity? It didn't shout. It simply waited. Waited to be seen or to be ignored. Julian had been ignored. And now he was making them look. The presentation continued on the shared screen in the boardroom. Slide after slide showed public sentiment spiraling downward. Tweets with hundreds of thousands of likes. Shared with captions like, "When you mistake the owner of the building for a threat. This is how institutional bias looks in luxury." He asked to see a watch. They asked him to leave. He asked them to read the lease. The PR director had stopped speaking 10 minutes ago. She knew there was no spin that would cleanse this without truth. A few executives scribbled notes furiously, desperate to look busy. Others stared down at their phones, watching the comments flood in live beneath the boutique's official social media posts. One image stood out, a side-by-side photo. On one side, Julian standing at the boutique's glass case, expression unreadable. On the other, a screenshot from the Forbes article featuring him in a tailored navy suit, handshaking a tech CEO over a $300 million acquisition. The caption read simply, "Same man, different outfits, same worth, different treatment." The hashtag Ashcroft audit was trending globally. Robert Madison finally unmuted himself. He didn't begin with excuses. He didn't speak in numbers. He asked only one question. What happens if we choose not to act? The answer came not from Julian, but from the data. Declining sales metrics, viral volatility, the risk of lawsuits, boycotts, tenant defaults, lease revocations. But worse than the numbers was the silence, the demographic they'd alienated, now watching to see what the brand would do when no longer in control of the story. Julian remained composed. He had no need to beg them to do the right thing. He had only to show them the cost of pretending nothing happened. He never once raised his voice, because when you own the table, you don't need to flip it. By 4:22 p.m., the vote was unanimous. Caravelle would not attempt to bury the story or frame it as a misunderstanding. They would not post a black square and carry on. They would act. Systemically, permanently. The first decision was immediate. Sarah, the manager who dismissed Julian, would be terminated, effective before the end of day. Emma, the sales associate who had layered professionalism with bias, would be suspended pending full retraining and performance review. Mike, the security guard, would be reassigned but not punished. His restraint had been noted. He had not acted out of prejudice, only deference to poor instruction. The second decision came with a dollar sign. A $100,000 donation would be made to a civil rights legal fund that specialized in dismantling discrimination in retail and corporate policy. It would not be announced with balloons or a press event. It would be issued quietly because the issue was never about visibility. It was about sincerity. Third, and most significant, the boutique would undergo a full cultural audit. Not the kind that checked boxes and printed posters, but one monitored by an independent equity consulting firm. Quarterly assessments, unfiltered data, public results. Fourth, Julian Ashcroft would assume formal oversight of Caravelle's parent company's ethics and inclusion board, ensuring that what had happened on the floor that day would never be repeated again, not at Caravelle and not at any of its sister boutiques. At 4:45 p.m., the last slide in Julian's presentation appeared on screen. It read only, "Belonging isn't a transaction, it's a culture." There were no cheers, no handshakes, only nods, silent acknowledgement, a new understanding of what leadership actually looked like. Downstairs, Caravelle looked unchanged. The lights still sparkled. The shelves still glistened. But something had shifted. Something had cracked wide open. And upstairs, the man who had once been asked to leave with his dignity quietly folded his laptop, slipped his phone into his pocket, and stood. He didn't need to explain what had been taught that day. The boutique had already learned it. The world was still watching, and change had already begun. By the time evening settled over Beverly Hills, the city buzzed with headlines that weren't written by magazines or whispered by concierges, but typed in bursts of digital fury across TikTok, Twitter, and every fashion forum that pretended to be apolitical until money or injustice forced their hand. In those short hours, a luxury boutique's decision to question a man's right to browse became the spark that ignited a public reckoning. Not because it was new, but because this time, someone had the resources, receipts, and reach to confront the truth, and no interest in letting it fade behind a press release. Upstairs, in a boardroom now emptied of defensiveness and full of consequence, the decisions made were no longer theoretical. They had crossed the boundary from damage control to restructuring. No more excuses, no more optics, just action. Julian Ashcroft hadn't left the building. Not yet. Instead, he'd returned to a private suite tucked inside the same office complex that housed the boutique. It was a space designed for mergers, acquisitions, and late-night negotiations. Today, it had served as something else entirely. A launchpad for reform disguised as a boardroom. On the glass wall beside the entrance, etched in chrome letters, were the words, Ashcroft Equity Holdings. It had always been there. The boutique employees just never bothered to look up. Across the suite, staff moved with quiet urgency. Analysts compiled sentiment reports, media strategists drafted briefing documents, and legal aides cross-checked every clause of the retail lease agreement Caravelle had signed without reading the fine print that could now undo them. Julian sat at the head of a long mat table, reviewing pages one by one. Not just the footage, he'd seen enough, but the emails pouring in from people who had seen themselves in that moment. Strangers, CEOs, students, fathers, women who had been trailed by clerks, men who had been handed cheaper alternatives unprompted. They weren't seeking justice, they were seeking acknowledgement. That someone had finally said the quiet thing out loud and refused to whisper it back into silence. And it hadn't gone unnoticed. Within hours, 3 other boutiques in the district had quietly reached out. Not to apologize, but to inquire nervously if they too had been part of the audit. They hadn't, yet. It was never Julian's intention to humiliate anyone. But it had always been his intention to protect the kind of people who couldn't afford to lose their jobs when they were told they didn't belong. The ones who were pushed out of spaces built with their labor, their spending power, their silence. He had no interest in revenge. What he wanted was architecture. New systems, not statements. And that required leverage. By 6:05 p.m., the store's leadership had returned with a decision. Robert Madison, still on satellite connection from his yacht, had reviewed the options again with his legal team and his PR advisors, each of whom had advised the same course of action. Choose the third option. Rebuild. Reform. Retain the lease. The others, termination, litigation, weren't just expensive. They were irreversible. So a deal was signed. But not the kind made with champagne and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. This one came with accountability. The contract was simple. In exchange for remaining a tenant of Ashcroft Equity Holdings, Caravelle would undergo sweeping internal changes. Every employee would be required to complete an intensive 40-hour cultural literacy program, led by an external firm with no financial interest in sugarcoating results. Store performance would no longer be evaluated solely on sales, but on inclusivity, based on anonymous feedback collected through in-store kiosks, QR code surveys, and mystery shoppers reflecting the true diversity of their clientele. A compliance officer, unaffiliated with boutique management, would be appointed to audit daily operations. The role would report directly to Ashcroft Equity, not the store. And perhaps most publicly visible, Caravelle would issue a written, signed acknowledgement of their wrongdoing, not framed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, but naming the behavior for what it was. Discrimination. No copywriters. No PR gloss. Just truth. They would also fund a 6-figure donation to a civil rights organization focused on dismantling bias in retail. It wouldn't be marketed as generosity, but required reparative action. It wasn't punishment. It was proof. Because brands could no longer afford to perform progressiveness while practicing prejudice. When the ink dried, Julian didn't celebrate. There were no fist pumps. No sighs of relief. Instead, he stepped away from the conference table and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked down over Rodeo Drive. The sun had begun its descent behind the hills. The boutique shimmered like a gemstone below, completely unaware of how close it had come to losing everything, and how much it still stood to gain if it was willing to change. In the reflection on the glass, Julian could see himself. The hoodie, the stubble from a long day, the man they assumed didn't have the funds or the finesse to belong in their world. But he didn't want their world. He wanted to make a new one. Downstairs, Sarah, the former boutique manager, was packing her things in silence. She had received her termination email 20 minutes prior. No security escort, no drama. Just a line stating that her services were no longer required, effective immediately. Her final paycheck would include unused vacation hours. Her exit interview would be waived. Emma sat in the stockroom, staring at her phone. She had been suspended, pending mandatory retraining. The message had landed in her inbox with clinical detachment, but the meaning was clear. The choice was hers: evolve or exit. Mike, the security guard, was asked to stay. Not praised, but acknowledged. His restraint during the incident had been noted in Julian's private report. He had done his job, but more importantly, had not overstepped it. And the teenager who filmed it all? Her following had passed 80,000. She was now being contacted by journalists. Her pinned video had more than 2.3 million views. And though she never asked for it, Julian's foundation would later invite her to join their youth fellowship in social accountability through storytelling. That night, the boutique closed on time. Nothing seemed different from the outside. But inside, the walls had moved. Because what Julian Ashcroft had taught them, without ever raising his voice, without ever naming his title, was that silence can be more devastating than shouting, and quiet leverage can shift an entire industry. He hadn't just walked into Caravelle. He had walked into a culture that believed it was too polished to fail, and showed them that failing wasn't about aesthetics. It was about arrogance. And in that lesson, they would either find their downfall or their redemption. 6 months had passed since the day the glass doors of Caravelle swung shut behind Julian Ashcroft and the internet rose in collective judgment. 180 days since a man in a hoodie had been quietly dismissed from a luxury boutique he happened to own. And in that time, something unexpected had taken root. Not just change, but transformation. Not the kind that gets posted once and forgotten. Not the kind that ends with an apology and a curated carousel of diversity stock photos. This transformation was earned, measured, monitored, The boutique on North Camden looked the same from the outside. The gold-lettered signage was still there. The crystal chandelier still sparkled against the midnight ceiling, and the glass cases still held timepieces that could pay for tuition at the finest universities. But the energy inside had shifted. Where once there had been invisible tension, now there was attentiveness. Where quiet judgment once lived in the tilt of a chin or the delay of a greeting, now there was recognition, not performative but practiced. Customers were now welcomed with warmth, not calculation. No more long glances before questions were answered. No more whispers behind counters as certain shoppers approached. The policies hadn't changed as much as the posture had. And in luxury, posture is everything. The boutique's new general manager was a woman named Camille Harper, young, black, and disarmingly poised. Hired after the incident, she came not from a legacy fashion house, but from a reputation for customer equity design. Her mandate wasn't to protect the brand's image. It was to align it with its values. If none existed before, she was told, she'd be empowered to build them from the ground up. Under Camille's leadership, staff turnover dropped 42%. Customer satisfaction soared. But more importantly, the mystery shopper complaints, particularly those tied to demographic profiling, disappeared, because the store no longer relied on guesses about a customer's worth. They asked, they listened, they learned. The cultural audit that Julian had demanded continued, not as a one-off, but as a recurring quarterly process. Independent observers posed as everyday customers and reported on every nuance, from greetings to eye contact to how long it took someone to be offered assistance. Reports were reviewed not by boutique staff, but by an external ethics panel composed of community leaders, equity strategists, and rotating guests, including several who had once experienced similar discrimination in retail environments. Each report was made public, each finding a reminder that sunlight remained the best disinfectant. The training that followed was more than a seminar. It included role-play sessions, blindfolded empathy drills, and real-world bias interruption techniques. Employees didn't just learn what bias looked like. They learned what it felt like to be doubted, to be dismissed, to be defined by something as arbitrary as skin tone or attire. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was visible, and that made all the difference. As for Julian Ashcroft, he had quietly declined every interview request. From national news anchors to corporate think tanks, everyone wanted to know what it felt like to be profiled in your own building. He never answered, because the story wasn't about him. Not anymore. It was about the system that had been designed to exclude, and how easily it began to collapse when faced with stillness and truth. Julian returned to the boutique exactly once. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't filmed. No one posted about it. There was no entourage, no confrontation. He came alone. This time, no one paused when he stepped through the door. No one side-eyed his outfit. A young associate approached with ease and asked if he needed assistance. Not with suspicion, with respect. He asked to see the Philippe Nautilus again, the very watch he had inquired about 6 months before. This time, no deposit was requested. No ID. No hoops. Just a key turned behind the case. A tray. Pair of gloves. And the quiet sound of someone saying, "Take your time." He didn't buy it. He simply smiled. Because some moments aren't about transaction. They're about testimony. Upstairs, in the same building, the walls of conference room B now featured framed stills from the original incident, frozen images of the livestream that went viral. Not to glorify embarrassment, but to document evolution. On one side, a printed version of the headline that sparked global attention. On the other, a plaque with a single sentence from Julian's closing report. Belonging is not granted by permission, it is upheld by culture. Beyond the boutique, the ripples continued to move. Retail brands across the country quietly began reviewing their in-store policies. Legal teams were brought in. Customer behavior audits expanded. Training budgets increased. Not because it was suddenly trendy to care, but because not caring was now a measurable liability. In the months that followed, Julian launched a nonprofit initiative, the Belonging Index, a watchdog platform tracking customer treatment across high-end retail spaces. Anonymous reports could be filed and reviewed. Rankings were published. Stores competed not just for sales, but for equity scores. The worst offenders were listed. The best, uplifted. It was no longer enough to display inclusive branding. The question had shifted. Not who do you serve, but who do you ignore? And the answers began to shape policy, culture, and, perhaps most ironically, profit. Caravelle, once infamous, now stood at the top of the Belonging Index's latest report. Because when you rebuild your foundation in truth, even the cracks can become part of the design. As the world watched, what started as humiliation evolved into an institution. Not a punishment, prototype, because this wasn't a story about one man seeking revenge. It was a story about what happens when power is quiet, truth is documented, and dignity refuses to be negotiated. And so, the boutique that once asked a man to leave without hearing his name would now be remembered not for who it turned away, but for how it chose to change. Let that be the legacy. If this story moved you, if you've ever witnessed or experienced something like this, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. Let's keep shining light where silence once lived. Because we don't just tell these stories. We make sure they're never ignored again. Drop your thoughts. Share your experiences. And never forget, quiet power changes everything.